Welcome to It's the Economy. What was big for the economy over the weekend? The Prime Minister launched the National Logistics Policy. That was on Saturday, September 17. And the policy seeks a unified, a holistic approach to logistics in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, and an overarching common institutional framework. The Prime Minister also announced, as part of the NLP, a ULIP, a Unified Logistics Interface Platform, ULIP, which will bring all digital services related to logistics on one platform. That's the big winner, actually. This means integrating 30 digital systems of 7 different ministries like road transport, railways, civil aviation, commerce, and most importantly, customs, which means paperwork of all these get unified. Now, what exactly does this approach do, and what will this platform do? How will life change for Indian industry? To answer all this, I have with me someone who's the most prominent player in the Indian logistics space, Dinesh, Executive Vice Chairman of TVS Supply Chain Solutions. It's an unlisted company, but a very large one. He's also President Designate of the Confederation of Indian Industry. Mr. Dinesh, thank you very much for joining me. Well, you run India's largest, or one of India's largest supply chain companies. What difference is this NLP going to make to companies like you? And more importantly, by when will it make a difference?
I think what really is the change, if I can say so, is the approach. Because ultimately, a policy is not something which is going to make a difference unless it is implemented well. In fact, the Prime Minister actually made a mention of that specifically in his opening remark. But the way I look at it is that the policy lays out clearly a path as to how I would call it unification of, like you said, the unification of all the services or all the service providers will happen. Second, as to how outsourcing will actually benefit. And if I look at the kind of asset utilization which takes place in India, one way of reducing the cost of logistics will be for outsourcing to increase, which is something specifically mentioned in the policy. Third, and the most important point is, while we think that it takes time or traction to make things happen, the fact that this policy has been discussed in great depth with most of the players in the sector will, in my view, result in the benefits of this coming through in less than, I would say, between 12 to 24 months. So if I look at it to specifically answer your question, I think it's a statement of, I would call it what they want to implement. How soon can we implement it will be between 12 to 24 months. That will not just be the government's effort. It will also be the private sector and the various players who are associated with that working together.
Oh, good. 12 to 24 months. Now, does this mean that, by looking at the platform, a company like yours will know which mode of transport to use, where, or is this about more the government knowing what are the gaps in transport infrastructure and where?
Actually, it's, I would say, a mixture of the two. And let me give you specific examples. When you look at most of the developed countries, the level of outsourcing which takes place is significantly higher. What do I mean by that? It is not just the transportation which takes place. It is the planning of the supply chain, how the supply chain can be implemented, where goods should be stored, how visible it will be made. All of it is part of the total supply chain. So if you look at the policy, I think it very clearly lays out the path or the method by which this visibility, this unification, and I would call it the outsourcing can be increased. So therefore, if I look at it, it is not a standalone initiative. It has to be combined with a better asset utilization. It is not just about own trucks or other trucks. It's about users outsourcing more and more to service providers. Service providers utilizing the assets better and thereby resulting in lower costs and efficiency.
Okay, so outsourcing of supply chain, and I can see that today all the supply chain companies are doing very well, whether it's All Cargo or Aegis or Mahindra Logistics or Concor. Would you say that is the key takeaway? That the key takeaway is that more companies will outsource their supply chains, and therefore we will see greater growth for professional logistics companies like yours?
I think the policy by itself is not saying that it is to encourage outsourcing. The policy says by unification, by digitalization, by laying the right standards, which I'm saying will result in more outsourcing.
Oh,
But policy does mention about outsourcing as being one of the stated objectives as to what they're pushing for. But it's a direct, I would say, indirect action will result in a direct outcome.
Okay, that's very important. And so the market is guessing correctly that specialist logistics companies could benefit. Now, another policy question, how different is the national logistics policy from Gati Shakti? Even in Gati Shakti, we were told that this is a coming together of various ministries. So how is NLP different and how does it connect with the Gati Shakti?
I mean, let me step back. I think one of the major, I would call it ask of whether the user sector or the logistics service providers always has been the fact that we have been dealing with multiple ministries, whether it be from the infrastructure side, which is the roads, the shipping, the civil aviation, and the operational side, which could start from finance all the way into all these ministries which we spoke about. So I think the first step was, I would call it the unification of the infrastructure planning, which, and I think I mentioned this in my speech, I don't think any other country in the world has actually developed one single digital visible solution of all infrastructure projects coming together, which I think is a very big achievement as far as we are concerned. But that's one side of the, I would call it requirement. The second of the requirement is, how do we then bring all of the players together? It's not just the asset creation, but the utilization of the asset, the visibility of the goods movement, all coming together a single, I would call it a visible platform. That, I think, is what the national logistics policy encourages. So in a way, the Gati Shakti program would have been very good for asset creation, but it may not have resulted in the best asset utilization, which I think is an outcome out of the national logistics policy. So I would call it, both of them coming together is the real solution for us to reduce logistics costs. If only a Gati Shakti had happened, yes, their logistics infrastructure would have definitely improved. Maybe that would have resulted in some reduction in cost, but not the full expected outcome, which is to come down to, maybe a high single digit or a very low double digit.
So do I understand you right? Basically, the NLP will be a huge saving of time and effort for the industry.
I think you have actually summarized it in a simple manner. It's saving of time, visibility, one documentation, and like I said, maybe we had some unique opportunity for India to become a completely paperless supply chain, because digitally we can link across multi-modes, across service providers, across users. The e-way bill was again a fantastic document, right? Because it enabled logistics service providers be part of the supply chain without having a separate documentation created. Similarly, this now will make multimodal come together and thereby create a single paperless digital solution.
Okay, got that. I think now I'm getting it. If I may move away from NLP for a minute, since I have a very big supply chain company with me, may I get your thoughts on the current state of the global supply chains? We saw freight rates surge all of last year and early this year because of COVID and the war. Now they have crashed. So can we say supply chains have more or less been normalized?
Actually, I would put it in two different formats. I think COVID was one large factor which did cause disruptions in supply chain, but that I would call it was, maybe a double layer or a triple layer on top of a already normal issue of a waxing and waning of freight rates, which take place based upon capacity increase and capacity reduction. Overall, I think the expectation before COVID, and even if you look at India, was that there were challenges with regard to how growth was taking place. And then COVID kind of came and hit us with a big, I would call it very strong negative feeling. Therefore, capacity was constrained. Now, what has happened is that that capacity has started catching up. And obviously, with some parts of the world having, I would call it lower growth, that is also resulting in surplus capacity coming. So I would put it in two different ways. I would say, yes, supply chains have been restored to a greater level. Is it due to production increasing significantly or capacity increasing significantly? I would say maybe that's 50-60%. The remaining 30-40% would be the fact that demand has also not been as high, or demand growth has not been as high as the previous 2 years was.
Okay, yes, and it looks like it might recede now. So how do you see freight rates for the rest of 22 and maybe early 23?
See, the only thing I can say is how we have looked at it. In fact, when we modeled our planning for even this current year, we had forecast that we will see rates rationalizing quite a bit starting September, October. In fact, we had said by November, it may come back to almost 10-20% more than the pre-COVID rates. Therefore, I think if I look at that as a specific example, I think maybe it's just a month earlier because it started in September rather than in October. But I don't think we have been far off from a basic forecast. So if I come back to your question as to how long you think before, whether it's going to be another year, going up and going down, I think the way I would look at it is that this is not such a volatile situation as happened with COVID. So my view would be, it would be a matter of maybe 6 months to 1 year before we start seeing increase in rates. So the way we are looking at least our forecast would be that rates will remain, maybe even slightly come down based upon where demand is more or demand is high. But overall, globally, I think it will still be slightly higher than what it was pre-COVID. That's more because cost inflation has gone up, but it is not something which will be radically different from what it is today. So we may have, I would call it, a more smoother sailing for a period of time. And having said that, I can always be proved wrong based upon what geopolitical changes take place. But leaving that aside, the normal business circumstances, I would say anywhere between 12 to 18 months of reasonable stability before we start seeing other changes taking place.
All right, we leave it at that. Thank you very much, Mr. Dinesh, for joining me with your thoughts. So the NLP makes life easier in terms of paperless, probably, travel and unification of several ministries. Looks like a very positive development for Indian industry. We wrap up on Bazaar on that note. Trading ideas lined up for you on Chartbuster.